I think that the way that we should understand this debate is a debate about natural humankind. So you all presumably know what a natural kind is. There's also a thing about whether you could say, are there natural kinds of people? Not whether whether the human race is a natural kind, or not whether the species is a natural kind, but whether there are natural kinds of people, male, female, people who are AB positive blood type, people who are carriers for sickle cell anemia, or whatever those might be natural humankind. Those are at least proposed natural humankinds. Are the terms homosexual and heterosexual natural humankinds? And then there's another point, which is that which I made in an essay that was written in the middle of the 1980s, that natural humankinds can exist even if they're not innate or immutable. So, for example, Freud had this idea of someone having an unresolved Oedipal complex, that's what made someone a gay man. They have an unresolved Oedipal complex. We could imagine that there is this sort of cognitive mechanism for your Oedipal complex. It's right over here, and if that's set, resolved or unresolved, that's a feature of the brain that could be something like a natural kind term. We could still, if we knew how to do it, we could do a brain scan of Socrates and see, did he have an unresolved Oedipal complex? Does it make sense to apply our term to him? And so the thought is that this debate between essentialism and constructionism intersects with, going back to the debate about whether science is the right, whether scientific issues about sexual orientation are promising endeavors or not. So here are some thoughts. One thought is, if sexual orientations are not humankinds, then they don't get heightened scrutiny. That might be one way, one reason why someone who's interested in, say, gay rights in the U.S. Legal context might be interested. They might think, well, gee, in order to show that sexual orientations get heightened scrutiny, we've got to show that they're innate or immutable. And for them to be innate or immutable, they must be natural humankinds. These are two possible ideas. I think both of them are wrong. Recently, the Iowa Supreme Court, very recently, in fact, just a few days ago, embraced same-sex marriage. And in doing so, they actually, I think, like Governor Richardson, but more clearly, embraced the right view, the view that I think is right about this. They say here, courts need not definitively resolve the nature versus nurture debate currently raging over the origins of sexual orientation in order to decide plaintiff's equal protection claim. The constitutional relevance of the immutability factor is not reserved to those instances in which the trait defining the burden class is absolutely impossible to change. The immutability prong of the suspectness inquiry surely is satisfied when the identifying trait is so central to a person's identity that it would be abhorrent for the government to penalize a person for refusing to change it. Now, let's unpack this a bit. What the court is saying is, so I'll step back a little bit more. This was, again, like the Washington case, a case where a group of same-sex couples sued the state saying we should be able to get married, not as a group, but in pairs of two. They're same-sex couples, a group of same-sex couples, each wanting to get married. And the court there, and one of their arguments was that sexual orientation classification should get, where our suspect, heightened scrutiny should apply, and that because the Iowa marriage laws make use of sexual orientation classifications, they should be struck down. And the Iowa Supreme Court says, you're right. Sexual orientations are a suspect class. Heightened scrutiny does apply. And what they said, and this is what I think is important, is that we don't need to resolve the nature-nurture debate. We don't need to know how sexual orientations develop in order to reach the question of whether sexual orientation classifications get heightened scrutiny. The constitutional relevance of the immutability factor is not reserved to those instances in which the trait defining the burden class is absolutely impossible to change. So one of the examples that the Iowa Supreme Court there gives, actually they don't give it directly, they cite a Connecticut Supreme Court decision which gives it more directly. They say, look, you can change your religion. You can change your sex through a sex change operation. The mere fact that you can do these things doesn't mean that that characteristic doesn't get heightened scrutiny. So the constitutional relevance of mutability is not reserved to those instances to which the trait defining the burden class is absolutely impossible to change. You don't have to know if it's innate. You don't have to know if it's immutable. Now, some legal theorists, sometimes including me, think that we should just reject immutability altogether, that immutability shouldn't be part of the analysis. The Iowa Supreme Court doesn't do that. Instead, they say we should ask a different question. Immutability is still important, they say, but they define it in what I would call a sort of soft or weak immutability. What immutability means is, for the Iowa Supreme Court, is the trait central to a person's identity, so central to a person's identity that it would be abhorrent for the government to penalize a person for refusing to change it. If it is so central to a person's identity, so there's a sort of centrality, how important is it or how central is it? If it's central, if it's so central that it would be abhorrent for the government to change, we're going to call it immutability. Now, I think that's a weird definition of immutability, but in a way, it stumbles into the right result. Okay, so briefly some conclusions. In the U.S., it is important to show that sexual orientations get heightened scrutiny. That's sort of obvious. But to do this, you do not have to show that sexual orientations are innate or immutable in any strong sense. And you don't need to show that sexual orientations are natural human kinds. It's not about science. It's not about natural human kinds. Sexual orientations could be social kinds, like religious preferences, membership in a religious group. And then briefly, and this is good news. It's good news that we don't have to show sexual orientations are innate or immutable. We don't have to show sexual orientations are natural human kinds because, first of all, there's no conclusive evidence to show that sexual orientations are innate or immutable. And if it were, we'd have a hard time making the case for gay rights. If it were a requirement, we'd have a hard time showing that we should get gay rights. We don't know. It's also good news because we don't know whether sexual orientations are natural human kinds. And if that were a requirement, we'd also be in trouble. And finally, and this is something I don't have a time to go into at much length, but I'll just say it here, making arguments like the Born That Way arguments actually will increase attempts to use reproductive and other technologies to produce heterosexual children, even if they're not going to work, which will have negative ethical implications for gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals. Okay, but I'll leave this slide up since those are my essential conclusions, and I'll stop there.